fourth day. We'll take a look at this. It's drone video showing the scale of destruction wreaked across the Gaza Strip over the past few days. Israel's army claims to have hit many more Hamas targets in overnight and morning bombing. It's also ordered a total blockade of Gaza, cutting off food, water and supplies. And the UN Human Rights Chief says the siege is illegal under international law, while the World Health Organization is calling for the establishment of a humanitarian corridor. Well, to talk more about this, I'm joined by the BBC's Middle East analyst, Sebastian Usher. And joining us from Jerusalem is BBC correspondent Tom Bateman. Welcome to you both, and thanks both for joining us. So let's get started. Sebastian, let me start with you. We had a question here from Robert Saxon. Doesn't tell us where he is, but he's asked this: what does Hamas hope to achieve?
I mean, I think in its most basic terms, Hamas wants to show that it is a bigger power, that it has more capability than has been expected, than has been taken into both the Israeli equation and the way that the world views the Palestinian issues in the past few years. By mounting an operation like this, it's tried to show that the invincibility that Israel, to some extent, believes that it has, despite the sense that it's surrounded by enemies and it constantly has a sort of existential crisis, but essentially a certain kind of sense of security despite the attacks that happen regularly, despite all the unrest, despite the violence, but that as an entity, as a country, as a state, it's no longer really under threat. This was an attempt to show that that's the case and to show that Israelis themselves are not safe. And obviously we've seen that with this horrific scale of people who've been killed. So, I mean, I think that's the first thing to say. And I mean, Tom obviously will have other ideas on that as well, because there's a variety of issues,
Tom?
I think, here.
Tom?
Yeah, I think Sebastian's absolutely right. This is about trying to project power in what is a very specific set of circumstances for Hamas, because remember the growth of this movement and its roots were in a sort of political projection as being a rival movement for the voice of the Palestinian people against what was the sort of secular, more mainstream leadership under Yasser Arafat in the 1980s. Hamas always wanted to disrupt that. And so the internal Palestinian politics, I think, are a really important part of this as well, because as they try to govern Gaza under blockade, but also present themselves to Palestinians as a resistance movement, that has become increasingly difficult. That bloody rivalry with Fatah that mainly operates from the West Bank now, after it was kicked out of Gaza, or its forces were, by Hamas. That rivalry has absolutely continued. So the internal Palestinian part of this, I think, is very important in trying to project that sense of power through these incredibly brutal attacks, as we've seen. And there were some very specific demands, actually, that they made at the time. I mean, one of them is about Palestinian prisoners. There's 4,500 Palestinians in custody by Israel. Around 1,000 of those are so-called administrative detainees, so they're locked up without charge or judicial process. And I think that's why we've seen these demands from Hamas about the release of prisoners. But clearly, you know, there's going to be no negotiation at all between the two sides while we're in this, you know, phase of bombardment, the scale and brutality, the savagery of the attacks by Hamas from Saturday, and then this continuing bombardment by the Israelis of the Gaza Strip. But that was one of the demands, actually, at the start, is they're trying to secure the release of prisoners, which is a very important political tool, because that is an issue that touches so many Palestinians.
And Mariam, I think also, I mean, what Tom is talking about there is obviously absolutely valid, but that's to some extent within the context of the rivalry between the Palestinian factions, almost a kind of internal things going on there. I think Hamas also, in its role, not just as confined to that, but as a voice of the Palestinians, which I think it very much wants to make itself, and of resistance to Israel, which includes Hezbollah, which includes Iran, which includes Syria. It wants to show that it is the most effective vehicle for that. And being in the context where we've had the Abraham Accords with normalization deals that have been done by several Arab countries, and the biggest one, the one that is the real prize for Israel, the US, is Saudi Arabia, and this was motoring along. I mean, many of us really didn't think this would be happening for a long time, but it's been going that direction. This, for now, has completely derailed that. And the point about that is that the Palestinians as a whole, not just Hamas, felt that they were being totally ignored in this. Essentially, it was to do with their future, but they were not being given a voice. And I think that's a key element here.
Let's ask you this, Tom. This question from Robert. Not sure if it's the same Robert that asked the previous question, but anyway, he asks, what would an Israeli victory look like? We've heard so much from the Israelis about destroying Hamas, but what does an Israeli victory look like?
And that's such an important question, because what we've had so far is a lot of sort of maximalist rhetoric from Benjamin Netanyahu, from leaders of the security establishment. Mr. Netanyahu said that he was going to reduce to rubble everywhere that Hamas is hiding. It is clear, or almost beyond doubt now, that there will be a ground incursion of some sort. I was speaking to colleagues in Gaza in the last hour who have talked about actually shelling from the eastern side of Gaza, actually heading over to the marina, to the harbour there, flying that 7.5 kilometres or so over the Gaza Strip. And that is worrying people already about exactly why that's being done, whether it's to a specific target there or potentially the start of something more serious. We just don't know yet. But obviously this thing is moving on the ground. The key question comes when you get past all the rhetoric. Once Israel sends in ground forces, you're talking effectively about a reoccupation of Gaza. Now, Israel removed its forces when it cleared Jewish settlements from Gaza in 2005. You have to go all the way back to 1993 when you're actually talking about Israeli soldiers on the streets of Gaza City and an occupation in that sense. Now, in a population, such a populated place after such a heavy bombardment, it's very hard to see how that works out on the ground. What exactly is the plan? Is this about a reoccupation of the Gaza Strip? Is this about a massive bombardment that tries to crush the infrastructure of Hamas, its key leaders, which Israel will try to do militarily, but then what do you do with the population? Hamas has been governing in Gaza, albeit under an Israeli and Egyptian blockade, for 16 years now. So the question of governance, the question of politics, what comes next, we just don't have an answer to that.
And I think for the Israeli government, for Benjamin Netanyahu, who's been in this situation before, we go back to 2021, we go back to 2014, in each case, what Israel was saying was like this, but on a slightly lesser scale. You know, that what it wanted to do was to completely degrade Hamas's ability to launch attacks again. But this time, what they're talking about is an obliteration of Hamas and its ability to govern. Essentially, it wants to remove Hamas from that equation. As Tom is saying, that essentially sounds like reoccupation, but that isn't what's been said, obviously, publicly. And from everything that one kind of understands, that isn't what Israel actually wants to take that on. So it's a huge vacuum. But in order to satisfy the Israeli people, the public, who are incredibly angry about the intelligence failures that happened with this, who are holding Netanyahu, who are holding his government, who are holding the military responsible for this, they want more than what they've seen. They've seen the airstrikes take place, huge barrages in 2021. We're 2 years later and this has happened. 2014, the same thing. They want the Israeli government to make good on that and ensure that Hamas cannot do this again. But that is, as Tom is saying, an incredibly difficult and complex thing for Israel to achieve.
We have another question, Sebastian, from Roger Long in Denmark, and I'll put this one just to you. How do Palestinians view Hamas?
I mean, that is an interesting one. I mean, I've not been in Gaza for a while, so I'm not, you know, wholly au fait with the sense that the Palestinians have of Hamas now. I mean, Hamas took power. It won the last, you know, Palestinian-wide election in 2006. It would probably win another election if one were held, but there hasn't been one. I mean, it uses, strong security methods to keep control. It brings regularly the whole of Gaza into the situation that they're in now. Now, of course, Palestinians believe in their right to resistance. They believe in their cause. They believe that they're not being listened to, and they know how dire the situation is there. But whether, you know, Palestinians each time actually want to be put in a situation where their families are being killed where they have to move from place to place, where they're in this huge danger, is a big question. And if you look across to the occupied West Bank, what we're seeing there is the main institution of Palestinian Authority, Fatah, really no longer has any real cachet, no longer has any real support. But what's been happening is that other groups have been rising in the areas, in the refugee camps, in Jenin particularly, which are not directly affiliated to either Fatah or to Hamas. And that is perhaps where the real driving force is happening within the Palestinians. And what we might see emerge from this is that those elements, those forces might develop more in the West Bank and begin to show an alternative to both Hamas and to Fatah. And from that, you'll gauge what the real sense is of Hamas. And again, you also have to remember that Palestinians, they're not all Muslims, and many Muslims don't necessarily want an Islamic state. And that's still the ideology that Hamas is pushing. So I think at the moment, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza, Arabs across the world are generally united, despite the atrocities, in the sense that Hamas has hit back at Israel, and they support that. But in the long term, I think it's, again, a far more complicated question.
OK, Sebastian, thanks for answering that for us. Another question we have here, Tom, for you is, how have Israelis reacted to the events of the past few days?
Well, I have never seen the sort of scale or the sense of shock and numbness in this country. That I was out of the country when the attacks took place on Saturday, and I've just arrived back this morning, and there is a sort of unbelievable sense around normal civilian life of emptiness. I mean, this is normally an incredibly bustling and busy and noisy place, and everywhere is silent. I mean, I arrived at the airport, I took a train to Jerusalem, the carriage was nearly empty, apart from some soldiers, and you get a sense of that troop movement. But really, it seems to me, it feels like what happened during COVID, during lockdowns. It feels like normal civilian life is on pause. I think people are hunkering down, and there is this sort of strange sense at the moment of a kind of lull after the shock. So you have obviously this huge bombardment of the Gaza Strip at the moment. The Israelis saying that they've cleared the area now of militants around there in southern Israel, but still a lot of activity, of course, around there, the northern border with Lebanon. But people are taking it in, and all I've seen really is people absolutely glued to their phones, watching the videos, talking to each other, people in tears. I mean, there's just a profound sense of shock and loss, that nothing on this scale has ever happened. And that's why I think this, this becomes, for all sides here, it feels very existential.
And let me ask you this, Sebastian. I think it's probably the last question we're going to have time for. This is from Jack Rovnik. He says, are there bomb shelters in Gaza? I believe that there have been several occasions in the last 20 years that much of Gaza had to be rebuilt after the area was bombed. So why are there no bomb shelters being built to protect innocent civilians?
Well, one of the reasons that's been given is that simply isn't the money to provide them for Hamas to do it, and they have other priorities. I mean, you would think when you are going to face such bombardments regularly that would be a priority. Also, as we know, the difficulty of getting in all the raw material you need for cement, for example, to do that. So that's been an issue. I mean, there are the tunnels, there are the places where the weapons are stored, which could potentially be used for that, but they haven't been. So where people are generally taking shelter in the UN centres for schools. I think the latest figure was at least 200,000 people are taking shelter there. And those, as we've been talking in the last couple of days, actually have signs above them to show that they're UN, to show that they're not to be hit by Israeli airstrikes. And obviously Israel has all the details of where they are. So that is about as safe as you can be at the moment. But bomb shelters, there weren't in 2021, and there still don't seem to be now.
I think we have very, very little time left. I want to ask you both this question from Nisarg Sandvardhan, but if you could answer it in maybe 30 seconds or so. I know it's a tough one. Will Israel and the Palestinians negotiate? Tom, I'll let you go first.
No, they won't in this phase at all. I mean, there are never direct negotiations between Israel and Hamas, although there have been indirect negotiations for quite a long time, but they're over sort of technical and security issues around the blockade of Gaza. But I think there's absolutely no question of a negotiation other than potentially indirectly over the hostages being held in Gaza. But I think we're not going to hear anything about that until very late into that process, if indeed anything like it is taking place.
And what about you, Sebastian? I mean, I guess from the Palestinian side, you could give us that viewpoint. Do you think there'll be some potential sort of negotiation at any point in the future moving forward?
Well, in the future, yes. I mean, there'll be some negotiations about what form they'll take and whether they'll get any further than we've had before. You know, it's a huge question. Who's going to do the negotiation? I mean, Palestinian factions are still totally split, and that will become an even bigger split. And both sides have become more radicalised, both in popular opinion and in the leadership. I mean, you know, there have been states, China, for example, and quite a lot of commentators who've tried to take something positive from this, say this shows just how terrible the situation is, having been left to rot like this for so long, that the only possibility is negotiations and to go back properly to try and get the two-state solution back on the table and back as a possibility, and to push that as hard as possible. But as Tom has said, there's absolutely no way at the moment, and there may not be for months, and what's left after this, the aftermath of this, may be so horrific that it could stymie it for years. But people have put this as a hope, that this could be. We've now seen into the abyss. We have to start getting out of it.
OK, Sebastian, Usher, Tom Bateman, it's been good to speak to both of you. Thank you so much for talking to us, and thank you.